Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is go through our last theory in our Gardner Reader book, Sassen's look at the global economy today, look at globalization and how it's connected to the growth of capitalism. So, with Sassen's theory, again, we're looking at how these contemporary American theorists, D'Amelio, Goffman, Sassen, and then Fine, with our second book of the semester, how these individuals are continuing to build on a thread. So, basically, they're taking past ideas. We found Cooley and Mead with Du Bois, and then kind of building onto those ideas and updating the ideas to fit our world today. So with D'Amelio, we talked about last class, he's pulling in the Marxist tradition to help interpret what's going on the level of identity, on that micro level. And then what we see with Sasson, she also incorporates Marxist theory into her work. And basically, we can take back to Du Bois to recognize kind of the main connection here. Although it's not necessarily a connection to identity, but what we see is a connection to the community sociology focus that started with Du Bois and that started with other Chicago school theorists and kind of continues today with Elijah Anderson, William Julius Wilson. And so you start to see Sasson kind of carried on that American tradition that was started with Du Bois, kind of focusing on community sociology. And so what Sasson's doing is kind of looking at the latest stage of capitalism. So if you think back to D'Amelio, how he kind of talked about kind of the industrial capitalism versus the pre-industrial capitalism and how that kind of reshaped the social world, we're basically looking at kind of the same time framework, but rather kind of pre-industrialism, industrialism. We're looking at industrialism, post-industrialism. So what we see today, we have kind of capitalism with a capital C. It's been very globalized in nature compared to the capitalism that Marx and Engels wrote about, the capitalism that Weber was talking about coming onto the scene. So basically, the idea is we have to recognize our capitalism today is still capitalism, but it's a different form. It's much kind of larger in its reach. It's much faster in terms of how it operates around the world. And so that's what we're looking at. So globalization, started back, when we talked about Machiavelli, but again, we can say now we have globalization with a capital G, and kind of connected to that is this latest form of capitalism, the latest stage of it. And basically, we say that's no longer kind of concentrated in one country. All these countries are kind of interconnected now throughout the world. And what you see with this new interconnectedness, this new globalized capitalism, you see a reorganization of cities. So you reorganize the system, cities are going to be reorganized as a result. And that's going to include kind of the community makeup of cities, which we'll get into further. So, when looking at the global capitalism, what Sasson really concentrates on are what she calls global cities, kind of the focal points in terms of places, the focal points of where the global capitalism actually operates, kind of the center of global capitalism. And she calls those different centers the global cities. And so we'll get into global cities here in a minute. But overall, we'll see kind of the reorganization of cities, the global cities emerging, and kind of what's going on within these global cities as a result. So here we're looking at a theory of social change. So just like D'Amelio, using the Communist Manifesto as kind of a frame through which you kind of see how change happens, Sasson's doing the same thing here. Looking at a theory of social change like the Communist Manifesto and how that change is going to ultimately kind of drive society forward, create social progress as a whole. So Sasson is trying to explain the emergence of these global cities. And again, global cities we can think of are basically the focal points, the centers of global capitalism as a whole. And so she explains it by, looking at the reorganization of capital flows. And by capital flows, basically how investments are occurring or how investments are perhaps not occurring anymore. And so what you start to see kind of compared to the industrialized capitalism, you see kind of a reinvestment So you start to take your investments away from, you de-invest in production. So production of material commodities such as cars, washing machines, clothing, that used to be in kind of part of the industrial capitalism in the United States, the factories, the mills, you start to de-invest from those things. So, basically you're taking the money away from that and you redirect the capital flow into other spaces. In these other spaces, you're taking the investment away from the material good production, and now you're investing that money in commerce, technology, and ideas. So basically, you say kind of the old economy was based upon investing in material production. We had the factories, we had the mills, we're producing automobiles, we're producing clothing and other material goods. But with the what we call deindustrialization, you start to de-invest in those things and take your investments other places. And when you de-invest in the material good production, you start to outsource for those goods because we still need the clothing, we still need the washing machines, we still need the automobiles. But rather than kind of making them here, we get them from other places. And so that's where you start to see the outsourcing uh, because there's no longer profitable. So now you kind of invest in new things and you outsource for the things that you still need but no longer make here. So the investments in kind of this new economy often is called post-industrialism. You kind of moved away from investing in producing goods, so now you're investing in commerce, and the financial systems, technology, and ideas. And so here she gets into, these changes going on. You're kind of de-investing, reinvesting, and what's going on to these cities during this transition. So the question becomes, can these cities, specifically the cities of kind of that more modern capitalism, the industrial capitalism, can they survive this transition? And so basically, you say that old industrial capitalism cities, such as Detroit, such as Cleveland, Newark, New Jersey, these cities basically cannot make or have not made the transition from the industrial economy to the post-industrial economy. And when you can't successfully, bridge that gap, make that transition, what happens is you see much higher levels of unemployment, much higher levels of poverty, and basically empty spaces. And so, again, if you think about the old factory towns, the old mill towns, if they haven't successfully transitioned to this new economy in which we're living, then basically they become almost ghost towns. The younger people leave, the younger people don't want to stay. The economy suffers, poverty increases, and a lot of old spaces that used to be used for production purposes or just general spaces for selling things are no longer viable. So they become kind of empty, abandoned spaces. And so Sasson's saying those cities couldn't make the transition into kind of this new globalized capitalism. But the cities that can make this transition, these are the cities that become the global cities. And so cities who make the transition by emphasizing on commerce, and basically, banking, investing, technology. So think about Google and Amazon, these type of companies, and then also ideas. By ideas, we're looking at kind of the medical institutions, the educational institutions, and when you can really have those institutions thriving, the technology centers, the medical and educational institutions, and then kind of the investment angle as well. That's when you can really build your city and become a global city that is not only surviving in the new economy, but thriving in this new economy. And so we see cities such as Chicago, LA, New York, Paris, Tokyo, all these cities were big players in the earlier capitalism, but they're big players still because they have successfully kind of bridged that gap into this new capitalism. And so for Sasson, kind of recognizing these larger kind of economic changes, what are the consequences of these economic changes? So specifically kind of, within the global cities themselves, so what's going on here? And she says the consequences for the reorganization of the economy is kind of seen on many levels. So you can look at it in terms of the economy in these cities. So what you start to see is kind of a lot of these cities, the global cities, the middle class shrinks, the middle class decreases. And so what you start to get when you have a shrinking middle class is higher levels of polarization, of inequality in the cities. So you have a lot of people who are doing really well. They're in the investment industry, making money hand over fist. They're medical doctors, they're educators that do really well, financially speaking. They're part of the tech companies that make a lot of money. But then you basically have the other end, other side of the coin, where people are part of kind of the service economy, where you're doing all these jobs that need to be done in the city, uh, the cooking, the cleaning, the taking care of children. But a lot of these service jobs basically don't come with a lot of pay. So you have this two-tier economy, very polarized economy, where you basically have those who are doing well, the professionals, and basically the non-professionals who aren't doing well. And this new economy creates kind of a new social makeup in these cities because a lot of these service jobs that don't come with a lot of pay are not very attractive to individuals. You have to rely on more immigrant labor. So basically, you start to see an increased amount of immigrants' presence in these global cities, and because the global cities rely upon their labor. And so disproportionately you see this presence of immigrants in these kind of lower paid service jobs, such as people doing the cleaning of hotels, people who are taking your luggage to and from airplanes at the airport, people who are cooking your meals in the restaurants you eat at. So it's kind of an interesting kind of makeup because you can see almost that the service industry is there to kind of promote the lives of the professionals. Make sure that your buildings are cleaned, the restaurants are functioning, and the airports are working, basically, kind of supporting your life and lifestyle overall. So that's what you start to see. So these larger kind of structural changes of the economy in the global cities, you start to see more disparity of the economy, uh, the haves and the have-nots, the shrinking middle class. And then we also start to see is a kind of new social makeup with an increased amount of immigrants because they are needed for their labor in these cities. And then also what you start to see is a kind of reorganization of cultural makeup because you start to see a lot of populations that are trying to do more with less because the money they're making in this kind of lower tier service economy doesn't really help, doesn't go too far. You have to rely on other people. So you actually have to kind of make strong interconnections, within your neighborhoods, within your community to, do more with less. So again, there's kind of a ripple effect. You change the economy, you're no longer investing in those middle class jobs that were in the factory, that were in the mills. But now you're investing in the economy that basically has professionals and non-professionals, and the professionals do well, but the non-professionals don't. And what they have to do then is kind of rely on one another. And when you're making these kind of cultural connections, you start to promote kind of more diversity and people working together. That perhaps in the past, when you're part of a middle class, you can basically get by on your own. But now, because you're not part of that middle class, more of a working lower class, you do have to make those connections and work together. And so this next one kind of ties into the political makeup. So when people are start to work together, then you start to see immigrants and lower class populations kind of crossing boundaries with one another to make up a new political force. And basically, it's a force that transcends class boundaries. It's more based upon shared beliefs. So here you kind of see a Weber's idea of communal action. So maybe in the kind of earlier industrial capitalism, politics was very class based. You had working class people together, upper class people together. But now we start to see is people coming together from various class backgrounds to promote political agendas. And what you start to see is diversity like you never saw before. And it's all about kind of sharing ideas, whether it be ideas about the environment, ideas about immigration. So people come together now, and Sasson argues that this is all a product of these larger structural changes. if the economy never changed, then we still have kind of a thick middle class that really wouldn't have to work together. And when you're not kind of working together, the political relationships are not going to emerge as a result. So it's an interesting way to again kind of recognize the economy as a driving force behind social change. When you start to have a globalized economy, the economy itself in different countries will change. You're going to have certain cities like Detroit, Flint, Michigan, that don't make the transition, and they basically are left behind. And you have cities who can make the transition, such as Chicago, LA, and these cities are still part of the game, but they are reorganized themselves in terms of the economy of the city, the social and cultural makeup of the city, and also the political makeup. And with these new political makeups, you have new strategies that can ultimately challenge and change the system. So it goes back to kind of promoting more equality, promoting more parity. When you have these different groups of people who never used to work together but are now working together, you can promote social change for a greater good. So again, it goes back to the Communist Manifesto at heart in Sassen's article. So it's pretty cool, theory, pretty cool reading because you can really relate to it. If you look at Lancaster, for example, they're really trying to promote kind of the arts because kind of other economies are not working, as strongly. So, overall, you can really kind of take this and apply it to not only larger cities, but smaller cities as a result. So I'll leave that for there for today. Keep in mind, this does tie into the final in-class assignment. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. Now, what we'll do to start to finish the semester is complete our second book, the second report on Gary Allen Fine's Kitchens.